Welcome to this week's episode of Taiwan Tech Update, your weekly roundup of tech news stories from here in Taiwan, presented by me, Tomasz Koper, and Radio Taiwan International. I have a fascinating interview for you today on Taiwan's reliance, or maybe even over-reliance, on the tech sector from one of Asia-Pacific's leading economists, Professor Alicia García-Herrero. Stick around to the second part of the show for that. But first, we start with the roundup of Taiwan-related tech news for the week of April 25th to May 1st. We start on the weekend with a Central News Agency interview with Tsai Seung-chi from the Metal Industries Research and Development Center. The center has recently developed what they call a disappearing mold, which could make injection molding in the manufacturing of things like drones a lot faster. Tsai says that traditional manufacturing of drone bodies often involves layering of pre-preg or pre-impregnated composite materials. During this process, the desired shape often requires internal structural support, which is often done with either airbags or metal support. The problem is that the former can't really withstand heat, while the latter can be difficult to work with, especially when it comes to complex shapes. The new disappearing mold can withstand high temperatures and pressures, offers high compressive strength, which means it stays rigid under pressure, but once the fiber composite structure is formed, the mold material can be quickly dissolved with water, which makes the process of removing the mold a lot quicker. Tsai says the project will gradually move from smaller elements like landing gears and airframe structures for logistics and agricultural drones to bigger elements like fuselages and wings in fixed-wing aircraft. Other players in the aerospace and aviation sectors are working on similar solutions, but approaches to the formulation of such a mold differ. He hopes that with its unique formulation and proprietary process, this solution will prove competitive in the global unmanned vehicle supply chain. On Saturday, the Taiwan Next Foundation organized a Taiwan Career Day event in Santa Clara in Silicon Valley. Major Taiwanese tech companies like Foxconn, Winstron, Phison, MediaTek, UMC, and Delta Electronics were present and hoping to recruit much-needed engineering talent. With recent U.S. government policies aiming to encourage moving manufacturing back to the country, both Taiwanese companies expanding their American operations and American companies doing business in Taiwan found themselves with job openings. One executive-level talent recruiter outlined a general trend in which Taiwanese businesses seek to recruit software and IC design talent, while U.S. companies are in urgent need of semiconductor and manufacturing engineers. With recent layoffs in and around Silicon Valley, this might be a great time for recruiters and companies with openings to fill to present their offers. On Tuesday, the Foreign Ministry announced that its drone diplomacy team will travel to the United States in May to participate in the International Unmanned Vehicle Systems Exhibition Exponential 2026, one of the global drone events that actually matter. They hope to make it easier for Taiwanese drone manufacturers to fit into the global supply chain. What's interesting is that the ministry also said the task force went to Düsseldorf in Germany in March for Exponential Europe 2026 to explore the feasibility of holding a large-scale exhibition in Taiwan. No details were given on whether that would be another offshoot of Exponential or an entirely separate event, but the will alone shows the momentum behind Taiwan's push into the drone market. Also on Tuesday, the Institute for Information Industry published a report according to which Taiwan will remain a major hub for global semiconductor production capacity through 2030. Now, you may have heard that Taiwanese chip makers, chiefly the juggernaut that is TSMC, have been actively expanding abroad. TSMC alone is pouring hundreds of billions of US dollars into projects in Arizona and Dresden in Germany. And you may have also heard opinions that Taiwan will get hollowed out and manufacturing will move elsewhere in the world. Well, according to the report, Taiwan will account for 83% of total high-end semiconductor capacity this year, with China taking up 10%, Singapore and Japan 3% each, followed by the US with around 1%. While in 2030, that share will drop to a still impressive 79%. Not a huge change at first glance, but in an industry of this magnitude, every percentage point counts and is probably worth billions. Still, Taiwan's dominance over chip manufacturing isn't going anywhere in the foreseeable future. The report also says that geopolitical and industrial policies are driving a split in the industry. The US is strengthening its position in design. Taiwan and South Korea are shoring up their positions in manufacturing, while Japan and the EU focus on supplying raw materials and equipment. Just think of how crucial the Dutch company ASML is to what TSMC does. But is all of that good news for Taiwan's economy and its people? Maybe a little more diversification would be in order to keep the risks down. This week, I asked those questions to Professor Alicia García-Herrero, the Chief Asia-Pacific Economist at the investment bank Natixis. You can listen to what she had to say in the second part of today's show. In the meantime, though, Taiwan is taking its semiconductor sector seriously. On Tuesday, a former TSMC engineer was sentenced to 10 years in prison for leaking key technologies. This was the first ruling passed after the National Security Act amendments regarding the theft of core and critical technologies. The defendant was convicted of 5 crimes, including the intent to use trade secrets abroad. His lawyers said in a statement that his motives were related to his family's medical care needs and economic pressures, and that it was regrettable that the defendant's remorse was not fully reflected in the sentencing. He can still appeal the verdict. On Wednesday, the Digital Affairs Ministry has raised concerns over the Chinese map app AMAP and its possible data collection capabilities, which could potentially be used not only to analyze social behavior patterns, but also the lifestyles of individual users. The app gained popularity due to a number of convenient features like displaying red light countdown timers and giving users a 3D view of the road. But due to security concerns, government agencies and the military are forbidden from using it. By this point in time, we're all no doubt used to the fact that apps, especially when they're free, collect and sell our data. In Taiwan, though, the issue becomes especially sensitive when the app in question was made in China, where developers are legally required to hand over the data they collect to the government upon request. The Digital Ministry said it will release the full results of its cybersecurity risk analysis in May. Also on Wednesday, the Denmark-based Alliance of Democracies Foundation organized a closed-door roundtable on counter-drone systems and Taiwan-Europe cooperation. Speakers included the Taiwan head of the European Value Center for Security Policy, Marcin Jerzewski, whom I spoke to for last week's show, also about drones. He said there needs to be government-to-government contact between Taiwan and Ukraine, but there are still some in the Ukrainian government that worry about China getting angry at such a move. Echoing Yezhevsky and indeed the theme of the entire event, Kathy Fang from the Research Institute for Democracy, Society and Emerging Technology, or DSED, said that many companies are going for business-to-business strategies since broader institutional frameworks are still lacking. Special thanks to my RTI colleague James Thompson for his on-the-ground reporting. And staying with Wednesday's events, an interesting development in the world of medical tech. The National Science and Technology Council presented its academic research awards to 160 scholars, including clinical cardiologist Lin Jin-seng. His team developed an AI-powered system that can predict acute and chronic cardiovascular diseases in real time using a single 12-lead ECG. Now, this is the kind of AI application that I like to see, and not only because I'm a rapidly aging overweight man. Kudos. On Thursday, Taiwan's Mainland Affairs Council warned that China's new supply chain rules are likely to impact multinational and Taiwanese companies operating in China. On April 7th, China introduced a new mechanism to investigate and punish foreign governments, organizations, companies, and individuals on suspicion of harming China's industrial or supply chain security. What that means in practice is that a company that, for example, abides by U.S. rules on avoiding products of forced labor in Xinjiang may be accused of breaking competition laws in China. Tech companies will also have to tread carefully since the industry is currently a minefield of sanctions, bans, and blacklists, especially in the United States and China. The Mainland Affairs Council says that it's likely that companies will have to develop a dual-track system to manage supply chains and an isolation mechanism for their China operations. This is likely to increase costs and add to the fragmentation of global manufacturing. On Thursday, the Taiwan Space Agency, or TASA, announced that their proof-of-concept sounding rocket, the SR-400, has passed engine testing and is scheduled to undergo flight tests in the latter half of the year. The tests aim to verify the readiness of the rocket's structure and avionics systems. The SR-400 is a small rocket built within a program with the goal of developing a domestically produced rocket between 25 and 28 meters in length that could carry a 200-kilogram payload to orbit by 2034. TASA says that the hybrid fuel SR-400 is a technology demonstration platform, and the SR stands for sounding rocket, which means it's meant for testing. They said it's a very engineering-sounding name, and they're currently considering whether to give it a cooler one. Friday was Labor Day in Taiwan, so not a lot of news stories. So I'll use the little time I have left in this episode to mention that this week was a time of earnings calls and investor meetings for many tech companies in Taiwan. Now, at the beginning of the week, I started collecting bits of information from individual companies, but as the days went by, I ended up with way too much information than I can fit in here. So, here's a quick summary. Things are looking great, financially at least, for Taiwanese tech makers. Profits are up, stock prices are swelling, and outlooks are very optimistic. Here's the catch, though. If you are an individual consumer of electronics, you may have already noticed that prices of things like smartphones or laptops have gone up sharply in recent months. And that's what's behind the eye-watering incomes of tech companies. As demand goes up, so do prices of components and, well, to be fair, inputs that manufacturers have to pay for. Everything from memory to chips to even packaging is getting more expensive. So if you were putting off any electronics purchases and waiting for prices to drop a bit, then, well, I don't think it's going to get any better, at least in the short term. Taiwan is associated with semiconductor manufacturing for a reason. Not only is it the seat of TSMC and other companies with a stranglehold on the global supply of high end chips, but the industry is also a key driver of economic growth. TSMC alone accounts for around 45% of the total value of the Taiwan Stock Exchange, and the AI boom is largely responsible for Taiwan's staggering GDP growth rate. But if you're like me, you might be getting just a little concerned about an entire country's economy increasingly relying on just one industry. So, is that concern justified or just a result of my overactive imagination? For an answer, I spoke with Professor Alicia García-Herrero, the Chief Asia Pacific Economist of the French bank Natixis. According to a recent report from the Institute for Information Industry, Taiwan is going to remain a key semiconductor hub, apparently, through 2030, with its total share in global production capacity going from 81% this year to 79% in 4 years in 2030. We've also seen Taiwan's stock exchange market reportedly overtake Canada's to become the world's sixth largest. This is according to reporting by Bloomberg News. And that's driven by semiconductor demand and companies like TSMC, which now accounts for 45% of the Taiwan Stock Exchange total value. So on the surface, it seems like good news for the country. But how do you feel about this growth and what's driving it?
Well, as you said it loud and clear, Taiwan's growth is indeed a story of the AI revolution. So I would say beyond semiconductors is also packaging, it's the ecosystem behind the hardware needed for basically AI adoption. Or even AI innovation, because you also need these semiconductors for training of new models. And so every time, as it happened literally last night for us, Meta announces, say, a massive increase in expenditure. It actually sounds like bad news for them. In fact, the stock market fell because it was too much. And are they going to monetize this? But for Taiwan, it's never a bad news because it means they will buy more chips. So, there's this interesting thing that we see in Taiwan, that even if the market in the US might actually hype about AI and sometimes, worry, for Taiwan, as long as they invest, and look, we are at estimated 1 trillion investment, US investment in AI this year, everything goes fine. So the economy, to your question, is becoming basically AI centric because there are no resources, and this is the key, in Taiwan for anything else now. Basically, the all of the talent, if you want, whether it's resources, talent, it all goes to that industry. It looks like a good news, but as an economist, I just want to warn the audience that this is could be bad news, because if that sector crumbles, you don't have anything else because you've bet all of your cards on the same sector.
Well, if we want to urge the Taiwanese government to diversify, it's kind of a hard sell
Yeah,
to convince them to do it
yeah.
right now when we have an industry that is like a hen laying golden eggs, basically.
Yeah,
So, are there ways to diversify that don't take away from this kind of
yeah,
focus on
yeah.
semiconductors right now?
Look, every time I talk about this in Taiwan, I mention the Dutch disease, which is kind of an economic concept that brings us back to the era of, basically the tulips exported from the Netherlands. And yes, everybody wanted tulips, and the Netherlands thought this is the future. And it probably was. But the point is, the Netherlands then over concentrated its resources in one sector. Now, everybody says, no, chips are not tulips. They are massively productive, they are high tech. It doesn't really matter for two reasons. First, it's not about exporting high tech, it's about using it. So In other words, if you want productivity, it's not because you export high tech that you become more productive. Okay, sure, you need to be pretty on edge to export, but how much of this AI is actually adopted in Taiwan? That's the key question. To believe that there is a transfer, a spillover from that sector to the rest of the economy. I'm not seeing that now. So that would be the easy peasy thing to do for the government, to make sure that, okay, we have an advantage. Now we produce this thing that everybody wants. Well, let's use it. If you ask me, even, subsidize it or use some of that windfall that you have from this very, very strong sector to transform the economy. And I think that is what is missing. The second thing I was trying to say on this is that, I mean, the second impact that needs to be avoided within this Dutch disease story is that when a sector is doing great, it can afford higher prices. Yeah, it can afford higher prices to buy land. It can pay more. So that creates a divide between that sector and the rest. Everything becomes more expensive for the rest because the prices are pushed up. Even if I have to say we don't see that too much in Taiwan CPI, but that's a different story. But we know, whoever lives here knows that things are more expensive in Taiwan. And basically because of this success. So then you need to find some way to protect from these higher prices sectors that are less productive. It's not about only subsidies, but you can gear part of the land, you can gear some maybe more free economic zones, something to protect them from that negative spillover. So this positive spillover, we're not fully capturing adoption of AI. The negative spillover, we're not dealing with, which is the price increase for everybody.
What is, in your mind, the worst case scenario when it comes to long-term negative effects and
Yeah.
risks associated with this economic structure?
So the worst, so what I've mentioned before are like low hanging fruits. The government should do it because it is based on the hypothesis that this boom continues. So you have the resources to do this. But of course, if you ask me what is the worst scenario, is that suddenly some of these hyperscalers, Nvidia itself, maybe, like a combination of they come up with a different technology. So Google is basically already producing its own chips. How does Taiwan fit into this story? So if there is a technological disruption by which the hardware that is now produced in Taiwan is no longer needed, this is a humongous shock for Taiwan. The other one would be even, bigger in the sense that maybe there's a slowdown in AI. There is, a recognition by governments, including the US, that the job displacement is huge. And by the way, this is, I would say, more likely even than, technological revolution, putting Taiwan aside. The second is more likely because we're already seeing this. So if governments start taxing AI rather than promoting AI, making sure that this is done more slowly because it requires a new social contract for people to basically be able to sustain this pressure, then the whole boom will slow down massively because all of these numbers of investment are made on the assumption, Meta's investment, etc., that the regulatory environment will not change, that they will be free to go, basically. But that's not guaranteed, not even the US, because the consequences, voters will vote with their feet or with their votes, and policymakers will take action, and governments will take action, politicians will take action. So, all of this is a big risk.
Well, here's hoping that Taiwan will find a way to diversify away from this very, very lucrative industry. Thank you very much for the conversation, Alicia García-Herrero, the Chief Economist for Asia Pacific at Natixis.
Thank you.
That's all I have for you in this week's edition of Taiwan Tech Update. Thank you for staying with me. And if you have ideas or opinions on the show, its format, topics, or just technology in general, you can email them to me at Tomasz, that's TOMASZ, at rti.org.tw. Please include Taiwan Tech Update or TTU in the subject line. I'm your host, Tomasz Koper, and I'll be back with another update next week.